So welcome everybody to the governance training. So this is part of the suite of supports provided through the Social Enterprise Policy Bank, and you're all very welcome to the training this evening. First, we're going to talk through some learning objectives for the training. So what we hope you will have by the end of this session is an understanding of how to choose and use your board of directors guidebook. What do we mean by guidebook? We mean a policy manual that's been tailored and developed specifically for this project. We're going to talk you through the development process in a few minutes, but that guidebook has been emailed to all training participants today and will be available in the online Social Enterprise Policy Bank. We're going to show you what it is and how you use it and adapt it to your organization. We're going to look at some good practice in relation to running effective board. We're going to explore board roles and responsibilities. So the various positions and roles on the board. We're going to look at some technical legal stuff around directors' obligations and duties. And we're going to look at the role of policy, procedure, and strategy in supporting a board to do their job. When you hear us say things like board members, directors, etc., we'll use those terms interchangeably. But what we're referring to in all cases is people with the legal responsibility for the governance and oversight of that organization. They're known by the CRA as trustees, so that word is often used too. If you're in a CLG or a company limited by guarantee, you are registered as a director through the company's registrations office. An interesting development that we know is that many people who would consider themselves committee members or not necessarily registered as directors, the law has told us and become clearer on us through the Companies Act 2015, Tivasa, or 2014? 2015. The Companies Act has clarified that if you're sitting in a role, a governance role in an organization, even if you haven't signed that form that says you're the B10 form that says I am a director, you'd still be considered by law to be a director if you're making decisions like a director. Okay, so we say directors, trustees, or board members, and that's who we're talking about in this. What you'll see when you open your email and see the document in there is that there's this generic template. Okay, so how will you adapt this to your organization? Well, obviously by doing things like putting your company name or logo or adapting the design to be in line with your own internal style guide or anything like that. So that's all the easy stuff really. What you'll notice here is that you'll see there's kind of details around your company status. So really the board of directors guidebook anyone should be able to pick it up and understand the kind of the legal status of your company, all of the details about you and how the organization runs. It's a how-to of running your company at that higher level. And so all of those details are there with your, if you're a charity number and different things like that. Here's important things in relation to kind of sign off and review. So you'd kind of, your board, ideally, you'll take this policy, you'll adapt it, and your board will sign off on the policy. So everyone will review it. They'll say, we need to make this change or that change, or I'm happy with it. And then they'll sign off on it, and then you'll review it approximately every 3 years is good practice for review of policies like this. The contents there. So we have an introduction overview about us, the company's charitable status, charitable purpose, and then how the board of directors kind of runs, the board of directors and their duties, code of conduct, how you work with the CEO or the senior manager, how board directors, how meetings run, how you do your strategic planning, your overview of your communication policy, and then there's some other final areas such as financial management, how policies are developed, health and safety, and other core policy implementation. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of decisions you'll need to make if you're going to adopt this guidebook as your own board of directors policy guidebook. So you'll see here, for example, that you'll have to change the name of the company throughout. Here's an example of something that will have to change. That's written in red. So red font means we have to change this. Other documents impacting our company's governance. So this is a list, not just of like the documents that detail how you do what you're supposed to do, but it also might be a list you need to cross-reference with this book. So for example, people who have CE schemes, they'll have to look at their SLA in relation to their SLA with the Department of DEASP to see, well, are there specific obligations in relation to governance that I need to ensure are captured in this guidebook? So that could be your grant aid agreements. The other things that you might have to cross-reference it with are certain quality standards. So for people who are, I'm not sure if the Down syndrome organization, if you guys have HICWA obligations, for example, You might have to just cross-reference. We're fairly confident, being very familiar with quality standards, as our name would indicate, that this guidebook will definitely cover most of your obligations in relation to any of your quality standards, but there's no harm taking a look just to make sure. So cross-referencing. So that's something you'd have to change. You'd have to go, well, what other, so we'd have to say our grant agreement with blah, our funding agreement with Pubble.
Sorry, Aoife.
Whatever that might be. Sorry,
Aoife, what was that thing with the CE, the SL?
SLA. Oh, thank you. I love it. Calling me on my jargon. Thanks, Bridget. SLA is service level agreement. So it's the contract usually between a funder and a service provider. So when the department, when a department or a body is giving you money, so funding a CE scheme, funding a staff position, they'll usually have a fairly detailed contract with obligations of the organization. So to be in receipt of that funding, you'll usually have to have your governance well sorted. It will be encouraged. They might ask that people are complying with kind of standards of governance from the charities regulator, or they might identify some requirements in relation to that.
And would it be same if other people, would it be the same if people are on the TUS scheme as well, or is that a separate thing?
Any, yeah, that's also government funded, exactly. So anything where you receive funding from a government department, a government body, or even a philanthropic organization, so you know, a grant making organization, they would probably have requirements in relation to government.
All right, that's grand.
Lovely, great question. Thanks, Bridget. Principles guiding our board of directors. This is another area. Hello, lovely little human. This is another area where you might want to change, because this will be unique to each organization. So what won't be changing, I'll show you in a minute, but what will be changing is, you know, what are the principles for how you run your board? This is some suggestions, you know, that everyone respects and supports, that we consult with our members and stakeholders. So you'll figure out the principles that will work for you and for your organization, and you fill them in here. You'll fill in your about us. You might have a vision for your organization that you've done at some point. Your mission, your values, these are all things that probably exist elsewhere, and you can pull them in here into your board of directors guidebook. Your legal status and charitable status. So as I said, this guidebook is designed for people who are going for the company limited by guarantee status. And you might be going for charitable status as well. So you might kind of, you see this registered as a charity, meaning certain, so you might take that out if you're not going for charitable status. You just chop that out. Does that make sense? Kind of how you work with this guidebook. So the red bits are like, really draw your attention to this to make sure it's saying what it needs to be. There's certain things in black, like say here, for example, to qualify as a potential director of our company, all applicants or individuals considered cannot be under the age, like this is the law. And where it's the law, we footnote it for you. You'll see here, these little footnotes, these tiny small numbers here are called footnotes, if anyone hasn't been to college for a while. So this is CA is the charities, what's that, sorry, again?
The Companies Act.
So this is
2014.
CA 2014. There's a guide up for all these abbreviations. Yep. We're saying this is the law. It's written here in this law that you have to have it this way. So everything is footnoted, so you can be confident that you're in line with the law. So the stuff in black, we're saying review it, make sure you're happy with it, but you might not need to change it. Section on charitable status. So can I just acknowledge that I see the numbering is a little funny on this, so we're going to make sure we correct that and resend out the guidebook. Devas, would you pop us a little to-do list?
Yep, on that.
So that's an example. This is all the stuff in the beginning. Let me bring you down to some of the stuff around charitable purpose. So anyone going for charity status has to have what's known as a charitable purpose. And the CRA in the Charities Act 2009 has identified these kind of four categories of charitable purpose. Any other purpose that is of benefit to the community is the one that, I mean, a lot of people might find themselves under that heading, but otherwise it's relief of poverty, education, or advancement of religion. Okay, so you as a charity are obliged to identify, if you're registering as a charity, which one of these kind of purposes you meet. And so we're in the guidebook, you can pick which one is yours there. So the the board, sorry, Adebola, what was that?
Number 4.
You're number 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, hands up. A lot of people are number 4, I think. Yeah, it covers, it's definitely an umbrella one. Although I do believe they're looking at changing that to include the advancement of human rights.
I can even choose number 2 too.
Yes. Yeah,
Number
exactly. Yeah, for you
I'm
guys.
not into religion. I'm not doing anything with
No.
so it's about education and the benefit to the community.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's common, I suppose, for many organizations to have, 2 of these, identified, that one of them in particular wouldn't cover everything, but it does touch on it, like education, but that it would be, broader and wider than that. And it really is dependent on what your mission statement is and how you actually hold to that.
Lovely. Thanks for that clarification, Devasa. That's great. So you could have a couple. The board of directors and their duties. So this one is getting into the processes like this. So it's really interesting. If you look at like standards, like what is a good board, there's usually like a lot of emphasis is put on the what. So looking after finances, making sure all the policies and procedures are in order, the company's running well. But the other one is it's very focused on how the board runs. So how does the board communicate effectively? Just like if you look at your organization, you should be placing not only on what you're doing for your community, your beneficiaries, your service users, but also how are your staff? What are your HR processes like? How's your health and safety? Likewise, in a board, we also put a lot of emphasis on, does the board run well? Okay, so that's really what a lot of this stuff here is about. So recruitment and selection. So where it's not the law, but it's guidance, we'll say it's guidance, so we've said that the charities regulator gives guidance on what you should be giving people when they join your board. So this is when, when someone joins your board, give them these things or consider these things. They guide us on certain things, but they don't say you absolutely have to have certain things. So that's quite detailed what you do and don't have to have. So this is things around recruitment and selection. This is things about induction. So recruitment and selection means, how do you get new board members? We're going to talk about that a bit more in a minute. Induction means like, how do you onboard people? Like you probably have had inductions in jobs that you've been in. Traditionally, people maybe weren't as considerate about how new board members were induced into the organization. And we are getting, increasing guidance on that from the Charities Regulatory Authority. They're saying you should have an induction process. Ideally, you're looking at having an induction pack. So we've we've written here a big long list. You pick and choose what you would give people when they're first joining your board. You might have an induction checklist. You might give them a copy of this governance guidebook. Obviously, you might give them the organization's constitution. There's a multitude of things. So you can kind of choose from that list what you feel is most appropriate for your organization. There's a section on training. There's a section on how directors and officers rotate. I'm going to highlight something interesting here, which is until late last year, we didn't really have guidance on how long should someone be on a board. It wasn't late last year. It was what they produced guidance. It was last year. How long should someone be on a board? We had people on boards for 20 years, and then we had other boards where people were moving really fast. The charities regulator has finally provided guidance. It's not the law, but they provided guidance that people shouldn't be on a board for more than 9 years. They suggest that you should move around. That can...
I just put a minimum of 1 year.
A minimum of 1 year. And I'll tell you what, by 1 year in, you're often only still learning the ropes. So it's why they kind of often recommend a term of 3 years with option for renewal up to 9 years.
Maybe I have to change that.
Maybe. Have a think about it. We'll talk a little bit about recruitment and how to kind of be, considerate and strategic about how you get people onto your board. So what's going to draw them on, what might put them off. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And often this kind of stuff is important because a lot of people have heard about Mary, who was on the local community centre board for 20 years and couldn't get off it because nobody else to go on it. And, so we have to kind of think about who are we trying to attract, what we want our board to do, and how we can be careful about our recruitment to the board in that regard. There's stuff around leaving the board, resigning. There's a thing about a board review. So how do you, good practice is that there's an annual review of your board's performance, which we have obviously and giving you a template, a service that you can do that. The guidebook details kind of how you think about succession planning on the board. By succession planning, we mean, who's going to take on the chair role next? How are we going to get new directors in? It's that thing of, being sustainable and kind of moving people off and bringing new people on. There's clarity on remuneration. That's I would be that section is fairly straightforward, and what the charity regulator says we should do. There's the role of individual directors, so that will be set out in your constitution. All of you who are incorporated will have a constitution, so make sure that your constitution is mapped against your handbook as well, that they're aligned. But the roles of the kind of key responsibilities of individual directors. Then we go into officers. What do we mean by officers? We mean those unique roles that aren't ordinary director roles, that have particular responsibilities. So most boards, the charities regulator would say you should have a chairperson. The law says you have to have a company secretary. That's not a traditional secretary and a taking notes secretary necessarily, but rather there's very specific responsibilities that role has, that's detailed in law. So we've written out there kind of the role of a chair. You might adapt that for yourselves. That's fine. The role of a company secretary.
Yeah.
You may choose to have a treasurer, but if you're going to be charity, you need to have an audit and finance subcommittee. So there should be a subcommittee that's reporting to the main board on that. And you might have working groups or subcommittees on the board who kind of form together for specific purposes. And then, you might have a governance subcommittee who look at your charity's regulatory compliance record every year, and then they don't meet again, for a few months. Or you might have a finance and audit subcommittee that meets every board meeting. So that's we've given kind of some guidance on that. And then there's some details around other board responsibilities. Including things like risk management, your annual returns, auditing and reporting. Where it gets kind of really clear on what your responsibilities are, where they move from good practice into the law, tends to be around issues of kind of finance, are some of the most key responsibilities that board members have in terms of reporting and lodging forms and different things like that. It tends to be around finance. Okay, so there's lots of stuff there around annual returns, auditing and reporting. There's a section with a code of conduct. I wonder, has anyone who's on boards here signed a code of conduct before for the boards? Yeah, you have. Yeah, I didn't
No.
Back in the day, we didn't have a code of conduct when I've been on boards before. So a code of conduct, really, like there is for staff, it's kind of like, well, how do we expect ourselves to behave and treat one another, both when we're working together and how we're representing the company facing outwards. So that's all there. Code of conduct. Very often people will be asked to sign a code of conduct on joining the board. Then there's a whole section on working with the CEO, or the person in charge. Because in a company limited by guarantee without share capital and who is a charity, you will have a group of volunteers who are the company directors and the most senior paid employee. And fundamentally, particularly if you're looking at kind of being a nonprofit organization, using public money for good, which is what a lot of us are doing, the function of a board is to provide a check and balance for the CEO, to make sure the CEO or director and the staff are doing their job. So that's fundamentally the role of the board. So how do you do that, but without also, micromanaging? And it's a delicate balance to strike. So there's a section, excuse me, on that. Now, while it varies from organization to organization about how much the board should be doing, how much the CEO should be doing, I'll use CEO for short for the most senior staff member. The most important thing is that in your policy, you clarify what that responsibilities is. So this is a suggestion. You will change it to be in line with what your company needs it to be. The most important thing is that you agree it and you work in line with it. Okay. There's a whole section on board of directors meetings. So what different people's responsibilities are, voting and decision making in your constitution. So just really make sure you cross-reference that. Board decisions in between scheduled meetings, AGMs, all of those things. And then we're into the last section. This is where we look at the role of strategic and annual planning, how that's done, your communications with your stakeholders, how you do all that. There's financial management. So you should have a robust financial management policy in place. So you're just referring to it here, and there's another policy there. There's a thing around the policy development process. We'll talk about that soon. And then there's health and safety, other core policies. Okay, so that's your guidebook. There's a code of conduct template. There's a conflict of interest declaration form. There's a register of interests template. These are all things that you're required to keep either by Charities Act or by companies. Sorry, the conflicts of interest is in company law, and then other things are in the Charities Act. There's an induction checklist that you might find useful if you haven't got one already. Okay. So running an effective board. Okay. One of the areas that organizations that we work with often struggle with is the idea of getting board members, getting directors. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm not going to ask you guys specifics. I'm not sure if it's an area you've struggled with, but certainly the further you move outside of city areas, the more concerned people tend to be about this, where you have less dense populations and things like that. I will say in all of our work, people are always concerned about it, but we've yet to find people who didn't actually end up successfully recruiting when we'd worked with them, that just thinking creatively about who they could get and how they were able to populate their boards, and get those volunteers on board, because fundamentally it's a group of volunteers who are willing to step in and take this responsibility on to oversee the work of the organization. So what I would like to do, just to give you guys a break from kind of receiving and actually give you an opportunity to engage and talk to each other, is to understand what ideas you might have if you wanted to get some more people on your board. What creative ways or different ways do you think you might go about trying to do that? If you have things that have worked for you successfully in the past, brilliant. Or if you can think of how you might go about doing it, let's say outside of the normal, ask your mates or ask, Mary from the other organization who we work closely with. So what other creative ways could you do to bring people onto your board? Does that question make sense? So we have looking, and I guess many of these have been identified by you in your own small group breakouts there. So you can look at internal processes. So looking at any dedicated volunteers or supporters you already have and encouraging them to undertake that role. Donors and ex-beneficiaries, if you have anyone who helps your organization, that they can support you. You can invite your current staff or directors for nominations. I am so sorry.
Just give Eve a minute and then
so excuse me, apologies folks. So you can look at your donors and ex-beneficiaries. So if you've people who've used your service before, new services, obviously that's not going to be the most relevant, but for people who have been using the service a long time, you may have families who've engaged with you before, people who've donated, you can write to them or send invitations saying we're doing a recruitment drive for new directors, and you obviously consider some of that messaging you've already mentioned in those appeals. And you can ask your current staff and directors if there's anyone they know who you think would be good for the board. An important thing to note is good practice says you should be recruiting in line with the skills gap in your board. So you should undertake a skills audit to see who do you need. It will narrow your pool, but it will mean you'll get people who are filling a gap that you might have. It might be in HR, or it might be in relation to certain legal issues, or it might be a local community representation, whatever the case may be. Then there's external tactics. So you might target key individuals, so community leaders, local business people, councillors, subject matter experts, if there's a local college, teachers, anything like that. We've worked with organizations who kind of identify their skills gap and then wrote to a few local companies. So they said, we need someone with financial expertise who can just guide us on kind of our annual reporting. I'll tell you what, for people who work in kind of banking or in large private companies around finance, the kind of turnover that our companies have is like counting pennies to them. So it's not a huge responsibility very often in terms of their own expertise. So yeah, we'd worked with organizations who wrote a letter then to people in different banks or accounting firms within their nearest towns to see if they could get someone to come on their board. And you can advertise, of course, in your free local newspapers, or you know, if you have local radio who might be willing to kind of big you up or have you on as a guest on a local radio show. And then there are specialist recruitment companies like Board Match. Not sure if anyone's used them, but we know a lot of people who've had great success. General tips around recruitment to your board, though, is do a skills audit, know what you need. And then the advice you already gave from your feedback, which is like, be specific, realistic, and clear in your ask. Share your handbook, highlight issues such as term limits, the fact that your agendas are really well managed, get your board meetings down to a managed, expected time frame for every meeting. If people know your board meetings go on from 9 till 12 at night, that's going to be a real turn off. So make sure your meetings are managed really well. And then highlight, as you guys said, the opportunities for them and what's attractive about the role, what's excellent about the company. Show them that you're a good ship to jump on. Okay. So there's a section in your guidebook called that deals with all of these. The section isn't called Running Effective Board. It's called all of these things here. So your induction is all of the information, documents, and how you proceed and how the board works. So we say proceed as you mean to go on. So give them the right documents, the up-to-date documents, and make sure that they have an opportunity to ask questions and they feel confident about their role as a board member in your organization. Provide training and support. So someone did mention that earlier in one of our discussions, and wherever you can, offer board members training so that they know how to do their job. It's one of the amazing things about our sector is that we're inviting this group of people with really diverse skill sets, some of them with no background in, say, organizational management or nonprofit governance. We're inviting them in here to do this really important job. So one of the ways that we can show our gratitude is by trying to ensure we can access training for them. Training doesn't have to be expensive. Organizations like Carmichael Centre and The Wheel, and of course right now MID and their partners will access training for your board members at a very low cost to help them understand their roles and the key responsibilities of the organization. So if you're not already on their lists, get on the mailing list for Carmichael Centre, for The Wheel, and obviously for your local organizations to find out what low cost or no cost trainings might be available for your board. You could try and make sure you get them advice if they need it, particularly when it comes to very important key decisions. See what pro bono guidance you can get from barristers and things like that. Running an effective board. So you can do your very best to run an effective board, but the only way you can truly know if it's effective is by actually asking the people on it. So it is urged that you undertake a board review. An anonymous one can help people to be really honest and frank. And then if you do a board review, you do something with the results from that review. So you get a report or you get the findings, and rather than just saying, okay, we're doing great and everything, you find the bits of like, oh, look, it looks like some people are unhappy here. Let's figure out some things we can do to fix this area. Some people are feeling like we're not being strategic enough. Let's look at how we can be more strategic. Some people are feeling like their opinions aren't being heard. Maybe we need to consider our chairing and how we can ensure all voices are heard on different topics. Examples, okay? So timekeeping we put in, there's not a section in the guidebook. This is referred to as scattered throughout it, but if you want to recruit and keep board members, be excellent around your time. So get your agendas and any documents people need to read out with plenty of time in advance. The people who particularly need that might be people who are full-time employed, people who have families, maybe people, there could be service user representatives who might need a bit of support to understand the documents, so they need lots of time to access that. Do keep to your time then and your agenda. So a good, strong chair who's able to move people through the agenda and get all of the decisions made in a timely manner is invaluable. It's invaluable in running a good board. With the meetings, as I have an agenda and stick to it. Have a strong chair who can help move the discussions on to keep people on topic. How easy it is to meander off topic and start getting really bogged down in the minutiae of certain aspects of how the company runs, to the detriment of other maybe important tasks you might need to focus on. Make sure that the board meetings are confidential and safe, and then have good minutes for all of your meetings. Make sure that they're circulated and that they're approved at the subsequent meeting. All of these things are requirements by the charity's regulatory authority as well. They're not just good practice. It's not just how do you keep board members, it's how do you meet your responsibilities if you are a charity or looking to gain charitable status. And finally, a code of conduct can help you to set expectations, to make sure everyone's on the same page, And hopefully you won't need it, but if something does go awry and you feel like someone's not operating in line with the organization's values or what's expected of the board, a code of conduct that people have signed up to, you can kind of say, look, as we all signed up to in our code of conduct, we said we would be deeply respectful of and listen to one another's opinions. So can I just remind each other of our commitment to that? So it can be useful to have had that everyone feels ownership over the standards expected of various board members. Okay. Again, all of these are mapped out in more detail in your guidebook, and that's really a whistle-stop tour of some of those processes that can help you meet some of your charitable status requirements, your good governance requirements, and indeed any practices you need to retain board members. Okay, I'm going to hand over briefly to Duvasa, and Duvasa is going to talk us through maybe some of the more technical things in relation to the roles on a board and responsibilities in that regard. Duvasa, would you like me to manage the slides, or do you want to share your own?
I can share my own. Actually, no, you know, Aoife, you've got it set up
Allow
there.
me
We'll just
your
go
lovely
ahead.
assistant.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so as Aoife said, we're just going to dig in a little bit more into kind of the technical stuff around what it means, what the role of a board is, and what the responsibilities are of the individual board members and the board itself. So it's a bit of the kind of boring stuff. It's really, we're going to go into a lot of the detail is within the handbook. Actually, all of the detail is in the handbook. So I'm going to keep this at a high level, just touching on the main aspects of the role and responsibilities. Okay, so what is a board? So ultimately, the board exercises control and is legally responsible for your organization. So I mean, if one of the words that the CRA uses to describe a board is a steward of the organization. So they are there in oversight, and they provide, I suppose, having your board in place provides a system, I think Aoife mentioned it earlier, that checks and balances. So it's the idea that they have oversight, so they have their eyes on it, while, you know, your staff and your volunteers are in the business of doing. So they're ensuring that we are that the organization is achieving what it aims to achieve. So specifically here on our screen, the CRA describes the board as a group of people who exercise control, but they are a group of volunteers, and that group are led by a chairperson. So the CRA would actually prescribe, or they give guidance to have a chairperson in place. And they are normally elected by the members of the company at the AGM. If you know, your status of company provides for that. They're responsible for the organization, that the organization would actually keep to its constitution. So what that means is that whatever rules and regulations you have put in place in your constitution, that they are the guardians of that, ensuring that the organization delivers in line with your constitution. And they're legally responsible to act in the best interest of not just the organization, not just the company, not just its members, but its employees also. So it has, you know, quite a large responsibility, covering a lot. Two specific roles that are specified in company law is, well, the first one is the secretary, the company secretary, if you referred to it earlier. So their role has very specific responsibilities, and they are set out in company law. And so just touching on what they are responsible for, they are the administrator, and they're responsible for administration and compliance of the board. They are responsible for putting in place, I suppose, board meetings and notifying members of the board and the members of the organization of AGM meetings or EGMs. They're responsible for ensuring that the papers are circulated to members, and about one very, very important responsibility is that the board minutes are maintained. So that's where we record decision making, and that is where we prove that we are meeting our responsibilities around our decision making, and we have those records there. Keep a log of all the decisions there, as I said, and may attend other meetings as well on behalf of the board. So the second officer role within the board is that of the chairperson. The chairperson is required for a CLG, and they have, I suppose, responsibilities that include leading the board of your organization and promoting good governance across the board members. So they would be focused on ensuring that the smooth running of meetings, so that everybody's included, everybody has an opportunity to feed into the meeting. They're also focused on, one of their main roles is ensuring that they provide support, that they supervise the CEO. So the CEO is essentially the employee of the board of directors of your organization. So they report to the chairperson. Moving on to that. So as you can see, so we've got the board on one side, which I was talking about being the stewards of the organization, and they're busy in the business of oversight and making sure that the organization is going in the direction that they have decided upon with their members, their volunteers, and their stakeholders, or their service users. But to ensure that that gets done, they employ or have in place a CEO or a managing director. What's really important is this relationship between the board and the CEO, and more specifically, the chair and the CEO. And to help that, there really needs to be a clear division of responsibilities. And that's actually really, really quite well set out in the handbook. So having a matters reserved for the board and deciding that and detailing it and having that set out in your handbook makes it very clear as to what areas within the organization the board has decision-making powers and responsibilities for. So just very quickly, that would cover areas of finance and risk, that sits at the board, employment decisions, specifically around CEO and remuneration, and maybe some of your higher level employees, depending on, I suppose, the size of your organization. Then as well, you have board membership. So recruitment, succession planning, training, all of those things come under matters reserved for the board, but also the governance of the organization. So that's everything we've been talking about so far, and everything within the handbook. So is that, and then depending on your organization, they're responsible for membership of the organization. Having that really set clear, it permits each side to push back on one another when you're straying into each other's business, and it makes it easier to do that. So then your CEO responsibilities would cover the day-to-day operations. So that's the real doing and the activities and that of the organization. So it's the implementation of the strategic plan. So ensuring that the actions and activities are in place to deliver on those. The CEO or the managing director are in charge of your staff team. They're there to support and guide and all of that, but they report back to the board on what is happening in that area. They lead, manage programs, activities, all of those things that I've mentioned previously. But what they also do is they manage the organization's finances, and again, report, so depending on the size of your organization, you may have a staff member employed there as well, and they would support and reporting back to the board on that. They can also, they would also maybe enter into and manage contracts depending on what your financial handbook may say, or your financial policies may put in place. And then they may also, or they will also cover some of your secretarial duties. But again, those things on the CEO side, they can be very specific and prescribed, but having clarity and agreement and understanding is just really, really important for your organization, and that positive relationship between the board and the CEO. Thanks, Aoife. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore two questions, and these two questions are really looking at kind of like that kind of shifting why and how the roles or the responsibilities of a board may shift. So the first question, well, actually what we're going to do is, Aoife, are we going to pop out into, you've got the breakout sessions?
Devasa, I was going to suggest maybe we'll just have a big discussion on this one. Would
Let's
that make
do that.
sense? Just, yeah. I'm popping the questions in the chat so we can actually
Brilliant. Close
the screen, and I'll pause the recording so people feel comfortable just kind of contributing there. So I'm going to pop the questions in so we can close the slides in.
Okay. Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll take question one, and then we'll follow up with question two, and then we'll probably drift on to the other also.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah, so this section is all about the director's obligations and duties. So We focused previously on the roles and responsibility of the board, but like specifically going into the director's obligations and duties, and these are set out in law. So there's the Companies Act 2014, and there's the Charities Act 2014, and they set out what our general duties are as directors of an organisation, or a board, or directors of a board, and also the fiduciary duties. It's a word you will find that I will trip over, so please excuse me. So focusing first on, if you want to pop on to, we're going to focus first on the Companies Act 2014. So if we pop on the slide there. So again, as Aoife mentioned, we're going to breeze through this quite quickly, touching the most important things, but the detail of this is in our handbook. So there, under the Companies Act 2014, we've got two areas of governance obligations that need to be met. There's the general duties under Part 5 and the fiduciary duties under Section 228. So on our general duties, we have to, the Board of Directors must have the interest of the company employees as well as those of the members. They must have regard to those. There is a duty on the directors to disclose any interest. So Aoife mentioned earlier that the conflict of interest, and within the handbook there is a conflict of interest register, and it sets out exactly how the board will deal with the conflict of interest should they arise. And we also, as board members, have an obligation to appoint a secretary, but that secretary must be resourced. So they have the skills and the resourcing. Under the fiduciary duties, the board must act in good faith. They must act honestly and responsibly in stewarding the organisation, the company, as I mentioned earlier, and they should act in accordance with with the constitution of the organisation and the law. Because one thing is, we're not permitted to use the company property, information and opportunities for your own or any other person's own benefit. And one of the real things that we really need to focus on is exercising that independent judgment. As a board member, you sit in a role, I suppose, that is that you are responsible for the organisation, and you must step towards it in your duties in Section 228. Finally, you must exercise care, skill and diligence as a board member, and you must have, again, the interests of the organisation's members at the core of your decision making. So moving on to the Charities Act. Aoife, if you could click over the slide there, perfect. So the Charities Act came back in 2014. And they have a number of governance obligations that we must meet. So if you are registered as a charity, so the first set of obligations were in relation to a company, a CLG. This would apply to a CLG registered as a charity or aiming towards being or acting as a charity. So under the Charities Act, we must register as a charity with the CRA. We must keep a proper book of accounts, furnish our financial accounts to the CRA. We must prepare an annual report, and that annual report is actually publicly available to our members. And that the CRA is informed should there be, I suppose, an indication of theft or fraud in the organisation. So that's an obligation of you as a member of the board to bring that to their attention. And you must comply at any point with any direction that is issued by the charity regulator. When you are registered with the charity regulator, there are certain things that you must do. And that is, again, compliance with your constitution, which overlaps with the obligations set out in the Companies Act. We must be focused on carrying out our charitable purposes. So that's set out in our handbook. I think it's in Section 2, and you'll actually have that quite detailed there. You identify which one of the four. You're always acting in the best interest. And again, this crosses over with the Companies Act, where you're acting in the best interest of your membership and the organisation and your employees as well. You're managing the assets, and that you're making appropriate decisions around monies of the organisation. So when you are registered as with the CRA, you must make an annual return. I know one of you mentioned about the charity's governance code, and that's part of your annual return. You must review your charity's governance code and submit your compliance record annually, and that record is then made public on the CRA's website. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of our obligations under the Companies Act and the Charity Act. Once you are a CLG registered as a charity, you then must, as I mentioned, comply with the charity's governance code, and that's where your compliance recording form comes in. There are 6 areas that we must comply with, and really, when all of the things we've touched on, they all fall into these 6 different areas. You know, running effective meetings. So there's 6 areas. I'm just briefly touch on those. There's the first one is advancing its charitable purpose. So your organization, and we've mentioned this already, really needs to be focused on that your governance and that you as an organization are leading and stewarding the organization in advance of the charitable purposes. So what, I suppose, ensuring that the reason why you came about is the reason why you're operating, and that your decision making is in that vein. The second principle is behaving with integrity, that you as a board, but that your organization in general focus on being transparent, behave with integrity. And so that is all about focusing on creating an ethical culture, ensuring that your values, the values that you have actually, that you decide to operate in line with, that are embedded in your governance handbook, that you ensure that they are through all that you do, that your staff have a clear understanding of what they are, and that your volunteers do also, and that you carry that through. The third one is about leading people. So this is about where, and it goes back to that clarity around the division of responsibilities, having clarity about who does what and when, who reports to who, and providing leadership to your employees and your volunteers. And also, I suppose, your service users, in that they know that the leadership there is taking its responsibility seriously. Again, there's a whistle-stop tour. There's much more detail in the handbook on this, but moving on to number 4, we have exercising control. So this is where we demonstrate and comply with the charities regulator that sets out how we actually show that we are controlling the organization, that we are meeting our regulatory requirements and our legal requirements, and that we as a board understand our legally binding governance requirements, and that we have, I suppose, policies in place that set out what those, how we achieve those requirements. And that we must also, one of the areas that falls under this is that we consider and we mitigate risk. Aoife had mentioned that one of the policy packages or templates that will be available is a risk management system covering a risk register and a risk policy, and that will be available to you. So number 5 is working effectively. I think Aoife really explored a lot of this in how we run an effective board. And that is, I suppose, running of the board, but I suppose leading in that way will demonstrate, and I suppose leading by example as well will filter down into your organization. And it's all about being very clear about having agendas, terms and timekeeping in that. And then finally, and this is really quite strong in the with the charity regulator, is that we are accountable. And this was mentioned earlier, that when we don't have clarity around our roles and responsibilities, it's very hard to assign accountability. And then the second part of this is about transparency, and that we're very clear about how we do things, where we do things, and when we don't do things, what happens. So that's having our policies in place, our grievance policies, being open and transparent about all matters is really important, and being able to stand over your decision making. So having your minutes in place, and some organizations will actually make their minutes available on their websites. That's a whistle-stop tour of the 6 different areas, but the CRA actually set out different poor standards, 32 of them, and they divide them across the 6 of them. and they are for your non-complex organization. And then depending on what type of organization that you identify as, there's an additional 17 standards. Some organizations who are non-complex will take on some of the additional standards because they are best practice and really push towards really good governance standards.
And it's worth noting for those of you who aren't going for charitable status, but you still nonetheless want to be working in line with good governance standards because you're internally motivated to do so, or because you might in the future be thinking about going for charitable status, or because you recognize that potentially when you're going for funding or you're in competition for things like that, being in line with standards like this can give you a competitive edge around those things. That this is the Charities Governance Code is a really useful guide for kind of for operating in line with good governance. But the governance guidebook that we have given you does contain all the procedures you need to meet these kind of standards. And in fact, for anyone, and I know it was a very specific question I'm glad to answer, which was like about kind of the charities CRA checklist on governance. The handbook we have given you, if you incorporate it or cross-reference it with your own and make sure everything's there, it will serve as the evidence for many of those standards. What I mean by that is the CRA checklist has here's the standard. How do you meet it? What's your evidence for how you meet it? And you can say, well, our governance guidebook details how the board of directors meets regularly, blah, blah, blah. So there's an entire column with evidence, and you can use your governance handbook to actually be the evidence for how you do these things if it's implemented. So it's a useful resource in that regard, regardless of whether you have to complete that checklist or whether you just want to be in line with good governance standards. Any questions for Devasa on any of those kind of legal technical things or the CRA stuff? We'll just open it up for questions there. I might just pause recording for 1 second. Let's move on to the final section before we've got a kind of one more bit of a teach, and then we've a bit of a kind of wind up section as well. So the next thing we want to talk to you about is just the relationship or role of kind of policy, procedure, and strategy in supporting the board to do their job. Okay, so the role of a strategy, what do we mean when we say strategy? First of all, when we say strategy, we mean like the plan. It like is usually 3 to 5 year plan for your organization. The strategy will be in line with the purpose in your constitution. But from that, the strategy will say, well, these are the 5 big things we want to achieve over the next 5 years, and this is how we're going to do it. And usually in developing a strategy, it's good practice to consult with your stakeholders. So that might be your service users, your community, your staff, your volunteers, your board, and all of these people are come together and work together to map out this 5 year plan. Why is that important for the board? Well, the board can be involved in its development, and that varies from organization to organization. In some organizations, the board guides the strategy development process. In other organizations, they're just brought in to kind of consult, to give their input, and then to sign off on the final strategy. The strategic plan can be undertaken internally by the organization, or when you're a bit more flush and maybe have a bit more resources, you can get an external consultant in to do it, which gives everyone the opportunity to really participate. But most importantly, what does a strategy do? It helps the board understand if you are achieving what you've agreed to achieve. It serves the same purpose as a work plan might to help a manager understand if their staff member is achieving the goals and working in line with their plan. So arguably a strategy is the document really that helps the board understand what's the organization said we're going to do, and are we doing it, and is there any blocks and barriers? We said we'd have this new program up and running by August 2023, but here we are and the program's not up. What's happened? What do we need to do? How can we help? So the board can really hold the team to account and ensure that they're meeting their charitable purpose. And of course, that's one of the key responsibilities that an organization has if they're a charity. So a strategy can really help out with that. The other thing is, for a manager, what many organizations will traditionally do is they'll have a strategy and then they'll develop an annual work plan from that. So it'll be, well, we agreed in 2022 that we were going to get this far on goal 1, this far on goal 3. And, you can kind of map out the work for the year. And that enables then the manager can report to the board on kind of what work is being done and how in line with agreed expectations. Does that make sense? So strategy really is a very helpful tool for any board. Policies and procedures. So if anyone's, I think most people are familiar with policies and procedures at this stage, but again, like with everything, I love to be reminded of what the simple things are. The policies are usually a document that's developed internally by the organization that details what you do and how you do it. I often think of policies as being like the guidebook to running the whole organization. If they all went into a lottery syndicate and won and got up and left, would you have it written somewhere how all of these different facets of the organization run? That's what your policies and procedures do. And it means staff who are new can consult. It means that when you have an unclear, with a manager, if you have policies and procedures, it means you can be like, go do the thing. Here's how we do it. Take it with you and do your job, and that you don't have to micromanage. It's all written down somewhere and it's all agreed. So they state who, what, when, and why things are done in an organization. So you can have policies on, how you deliver such and such a service, how you do your finance, how you do your HR, how do you, we've put policies in there like lone working policies for people who have times where one person works on their own. You have human resource policies. There's, for every aspect of your organization, there's a potential policy that could be applied to it. Why is this useful to the board, or what's the board's kind of responsibility with and relationship to that? You'll know from looking at the board guidebook that policies can be cumbersome to develop. And with a group of volunteers, it would be a big ask to ask the board to develop policies. And indeed, many people feel it's a big ask to ask the board to even sign off on all policies. Some organizations, the board sign off on every policy. In some organizations, they only sign off on the higher risk ones, such as human resources, health and safety, governance, and finance, where operational policies, by operational, we mean the stuff that happens on the ground, the service delivery, the sign off on that can be devolved to the CEO or the most senior staff member. It really is up to the organization how that's done. As we say with everything, what's most important is that it's discussed and it's agreed and it's followed through. Okay, so policies, what you then have in all policies, it will kind of detail what should be reported to the board and when in relation to that area. So in HR, it might say if there is a grievance, a formal grievance, the board should be notified. It might say, in the media policy, it might say if there's anything that could bring the organization's reputation into disrepute, this is notified to the board. So it kind of details within the policies what would be communicated to the board and when and what their role is. So that's kind of policies, procedures, and strategy, and its relationship to the board. So I'm going to pause for a minute and just let everyone take a breath and see, is there any questions coming up for anyone at the moment on anything that we've looked at so far?